Tonight, Washington isn't calmly sipping coffee and passing routine legislation. No, it's gripping the armrests because something just happened that was supposed to be impossible. In a 74-26 vote, the United States Senate blocked President Donald Trump from launching a sweeping 25% tariff strike against Canada under national security powers. Not slowed down, not delayed, blocked. That's not business as usual. That's Congress looking at the cockpit and saying, "We're taking control." For years, Section 232, the National Security Clause, has been the executive branch's favorite multi-tool. Presidents could invoke it, impose tariffs, and let the rest of the world adjust accordingly. And President Trump has used it with confidence, sometimes unpredictably, always dramatically. But this time, the drama hit a wall. Because standing across the border wasn't a leader throwing counterpunches on social media. It was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former central banker who doesn't do outrage. He does spreadsheets. And apparently, the spreadsheets won. Tonight, we're breaking this down clearly and calmly, because when markets swing and politicians shout, clarity becomes a public service. We'll walk through what actually happened inside the Senate, why Republicans broke ranks, how Carney engineered quiet leverage, what this means for America's global position, and what happens next. If you want analysis that goes beyond headlines, the strategy behind the spectacle, the math behind the messaging, you're in the right place. So before we dive in, take 2 seconds. Subscribe to Global Political Insight, activate the notification bell, and stay at the heart of the news. Not when it's filtered, not when it's sanitized, but when it's still shifting in real time. Because history doesn't always knock politely. Sometimes it barges in with a vote count. Let's get straight to it. Let's slow this down, because what happened in the Senate wasn't just a vote. It was a moment. 74 senators, Republicans and Democrats, voted to block President Donald Trump from imposing 25% tariffs on Canada under Section 232 National Security Authority. 74. In today's Washington, you can barely get bipartisan agreement on the time of day. But somehow, 74 senators agreed on this. Launching an economic war with Canada was a bad idea. That's not routine oversight. That's institutional self-preservation. Now, to understand the weight of this vote, you have to understand Section 232. It's the legal tool that allows a president to declare certain imports a national security threat and slap tariffs on them without asking Congress for permission. It was designed for extreme cases, wartime vulnerabilities, critical industries at risk. Over time, it became something else. Under President Trump, Section 232 evolved into a rapid response policy lever. If a trade partner wasn't cooperating, tariffs appeared. If negotiations stalled, tariffs loomed. It was economic brinkmanship, and often it worked. But this time, the target wasn't a distant rival. It was Canada, America's largest trading partner, its closest ally, its economic twin in sectors like energy, autos, agriculture, and manufacturing. The proposed 25% tariff wasn't surgical. It was universal. Oil, cars, lumber, food, everything crossing the northern border. And the timeline? Immediate. Markets reacted. Industry groups mobilized. Governors started calling senators. CEOs started sending memos that probably use phrases like catastrophic disruption and please do not do this. Then came the vote. What makes this extraordinary isn't just the bipartisan majority. It's who defected. 25 Republicans crossed the aisle, not the usual critics, not the symbolic dissenters. Senators from red states, senators who depend on presidential endorsement, senators who normally move in sync with the White House. And they didn't whisper their objection. They formalized it. A 74-26 margin is not a gentle suggestion. It's a declaration. Congress essentially said, trade wars with our largest partner are not a solo act. This was the legislative branch reclaiming authority, quietly, legally, decisively. And here's the sharper edge of this story. For years, critics argued that Congress had surrendered too much power over trade policy to the executive branch, that Section 232 had become too elastic, too convenient, too political. This vote snapped the elastic back, not because lawmakers suddenly discovered constitutional theory, but because the math became unavoidable. A 25% tariff on Canadian imports doesn't punish Ottawa first. It punishes supply chains. It punishes refineries. It punishes factories that depend on cross-border parts arriving on time. In other words, it punishes voters. And when voter pain becomes measurable, political courage suddenly becomes easier to find. Let's be clear. This wasn't a philosophical rebellion. It was a practical one. Senators weren't debating abstract sovereignty. They were staring at projected gas prices, manufacturing shutdown estimates, and polling numbers in swing counties. When those numbers aligned, so did the votes. And that's why this moment matters. For the first time in this presidency, unpredictability met resistance from inside the president's own party. Not from cable news, not from foreign governments, but from the U.S. Senate floor. The gavel came down, and with it, a message. Executive power has limits, especially when it threatens the economic base of the people who are supposed to defend it. That's not chaos. That's the system reasserting itself. And in Washington, that's about as dramatic as it gets. Now let's talk about the real shockwave, because the most surprising part of this story isn't that Democrats opposed the tariffs. It's that 25 Republicans did too. For years, President Donald Trump has maintained a powerful grip on his party. His endorsements matter. His criticism can end careers. Crossing him has rarely been politically comfortable. So why did it suddenly become politically convenient? The short answer, economics is louder than ideology. The longer answer is more interesting. 1. The red state reality check. Many of the Republican senators who voted against the tariffs represent states deeply intertwined with Canada's economy. We're talking about auto manufacturing in Michigan. Energy flows through the Midwest. Agriculture in border states. Supply chains that cross the U.S.-Canada border multiple times before a finished product even reaches a showroom. A car assembled in the United States might include parts that cross the Canadian border 5 or 6 times. Now imagine adding 25% each time. That's not a trade tactic, that's arithmetic violence. When local business leaders began outlining what would happen, assembly lines idling within days, refinery disruptions, cost spikes, senators faced a very simple political dilemma. Defend the tariff theory or defend the jobs back home. The theory lost. 2. The donor alarm system. Corporate America may tolerate volatility for a headline cycle. It does not tolerate it for quarterly earnings. Behind the scenes, CEOs reportedly warned lawmakers that the tariffs would trigger immediate operational chaos. Not 6 months from now, not hypothetically, immediately. Manufacturers don't operate on patriotic slogans. They operate on timing, cost predictability, and supply certainty. A 25% tariff on Canadian imports meant contracts rewritten overnight, logistics recalculated, price adjustments passed directly to consumers. And here's where the satire writes itself. Free market conservatives suddenly rediscovered their devotion to free markets, not because philosophy changed, because spreadsheets did. 3. Voter fatigue is real. There's another factor that may matter even more. Inflation psychology. Voters are sensitive to prices right now. Gas prices, grocery bills, housing materials. A tariff on Canadian energy and lumber isn't abstract policy. It's visible at the pump and the checkout line. And when voters see higher prices, they rarely blame complex geopolitical strategy. They blame whoever's name is on the news that week. For senators facing re-election, that risk became impossible to ignore. Supporting the tariffs meant gambling that voters would interpret higher costs as strength. Blocking them meant appearing pragmatic. In politics, pragmatism usually wins over symbolism, especially when inflation is involved. 4. Fear, but not the kind you think. Was there fear involved? Yes, but not fear of the president, fear of economic blowback. One lawmaker reportedly summarized it bluntly. You cannot sell a self-inflicted recession as a patriotic gesture. That's the moment loyalty begins to bend. And this is what makes Part 2 so significant. This wasn't an ideological divorce. It was a cost-benefit recalculation. Republican senators didn't suddenly oppose tough trade policy. Many of them have supported it in the past. But this specific move, a blanket 25% tariff on the country most economically integrated with the United States, crossed from strategic leverage into systemic risk. And systemic risk is something politicians instinctively avoid when elections are within sight. In the end, the choice wasn't between Trump and Canada. It was between short-term political obedience and long-term economic damage. And when the vote came, 25 Republicans decided that angering the White House was safer than angering every business owner in their state. That's not rebellion, that's survival. And in Washington, survival is often the most bipartisan value of all. If Part 1 was about shock and Part 2 was about survival, Part 3 is about strategy. Because while Washington was escalating rhetorically, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was doing something far less dramatic and far more dangerous. He was calculating. Now, Carney is not a career political brawler. He's a former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He has spent years navigating financial crises, currency shocks, and systemic risk. He doesn't respond to volatility emotionally. He stress tests it. So when President Donald Trump announced 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, Carney didn't hold a fiery press conference. He didn't launch into moral outrage. He opened a spreadsheet, and then he opened a phone line. One, bypassing the White House. Here's the first move that caught Washington off guard. Carney didn't focus his pressure on the Oval Office. He focused it on Congress. Reports indicate that Canadian officials reached out directly to U.S. governors, senators, business associations, and labor leaders. They didn't threaten retaliation in dramatic terms. They presented localized economic impact projections. Not America will suffer, but District 7 will lose 4,200 jobs. Not your economy is at risk, but your refinery shuts down in 36 hours. This was not diplomacy in the ceremonial sense. It was targeted persuasion. Carney understood something fundamental. In the American system, economic pain travels upward through political pressure. If you want Washington to listen, you start in Ohio. 2, precision retaliation. At the same time, Canada prepared retaliatory measures, but not randomly. The proposed counter tariffs were curated. Bourbon from Kentucky, electronics from Texas, agricultural products from politically sensitive states. That wasn't coincidence. It was mapping. And that's where the satire practically writes itself. While Washington debated national security rhetoric, Ottawa was studying congressional district maps. Carney wasn't trying to win a television argument. He was trying to trigger political math inside the Senate. And he succeeded. 3, turning threats into leverage. Here's the deeper layer. Every time the White House escalated, Carney reframed it as instability. He signaled to investors and global partners that Canada offered predictability, stability, rule-based trade. In other words, while tariffs were being announced, Canada was marketing reliability. That's subtle, but powerful. Markets prefer calm. Businesses prefer certainty. When volatility increases in one country, capital often drifts toward another. Carney, with his central banking background, understands that psychology instinctively. He didn't need to overpower the United States. He needed to look steadier than it. And in global economics, perception can be leverage. 4, ice versus fire. There's a stark contrast here. President Trump's negotiating style often relies on unpredictability, what some call the madman theory. Escalate hard enough, and the other side makes concessions to avoid chaos. But that strategy works best when the opponent fears chaos more than you do. Carney didn't flinch. He didn't rush to Florida. He didn't offer symbolic concessions. He calmly prepared proportional responses and let American lawmakers absorb the projected consequences. If Trump is fire, loud, fast, consuming oxygen, Carney is ice. Slow, controlled, and capable of reshaping the terrain without making a sound. And in this round, ice held. 5, the long game. Perhaps most importantly, Carney played beyond the immediate crisis. This wasn't just about stopping tariffs. It was about demonstrating that Canada would not negotiate under threat. That message resonates globally. If Canada can withstand pressure from its largest trading partner and reverse it, that sends a signal to allies and rivals alike. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it quietly distributes data packets until your opponent's coalition dissolves. And that's what happened here. Carney didn't defeat the president directly. He made the system correct itself. In geopolitics, that's not flashy. It's effective. And sometimes, effective is more powerful than loud. Now let's zoom out. Because this isn't just a US-Canada trade dispute. This is a signal flare visible far beyond North America. For more than 70 years, the United States has been the central pillar of the global economic order. Whether under Republicans or Democrats, Washington has projected a certain consistency. It sets the tone, others react. Allies may grumble, rivals may resist. But rarely does a close partner successfully push back and win. That's what makes this moment different. When the Senate overrides a president's trade maneuver by a 74-26 margin, it tells the world something important. American power is real, but it is not automatic. And perhaps more importantly, it is not unilateral. 1. Who speaks for America? Foreign capitals are now asking a quiet but significant question. When negotiating with the United States, who exactly are you negotiating with? The White House or Congress? In theory, that division is a feature of American democracy, checks and balances, separation of powers. In practice, it introduces uncertainty. Markets dislike uncertainty. Diplomats dislike uncertainty even more. If executive policy can be reversed by legislative revolt, allies may hesitate before reacting dramatically to threats. They may wait, they may calculate, they may test. Canada just demonstrated that waiting can work. That's a lesson others will study carefully. 2. The strength paradox. President Donald Trump has often framed tariffs as a show of strength, economic muscle used to extract concessions. But here's the paradox. When a show of strength is blocked internally, it can appear as vulnerability. Not because the country is weak, the United States remains the world's largest economy and dominant military power, but because its internal consensus is visibly fractured. In global politics, perception matters almost as much as capability. If other nations believe that Congress may intervene when economic costs become too high, the leverage of tariff threats weakens. That doesn't eliminate U.S. influence. It recalibrates it. 3. The ally that said no. There's also symbolism here. Canada is not an adversary. It's one of America's closest allies, a NATO partner, a neighbor with deeply integrated supply chains. When even Canada is willing to push back and Congress sides with the economic argument, it signals that the era of automatic compliance may be fading. European leaders are watching. Asian economies are watching. Even strategic competitors are watching. Not to celebrate, but to assess. They are asking, is this a one-time correction or a structural shift in how American trade power operates? 4. Markets versus politics. Another key takeaway, markets appear to have sided with stability. When the Senate vote passed, market volatility eased. Investors interpreted it as a guardrail, a sign that institutional brakes still function. In some ways, this may strengthen confidence in the American system. It shows that even bold executive actions face constraints. But politically, it complicates the narrative. The president framed tariffs as decisive leadership. Congress framed restraint as responsible governance. Both claim to be defending American interests. The world now sees that those definitions differ. 5. A new negotiating landscape. We may be entering a new phase in global trade politics, one where threats are tested, where allies consult domestic political maps before responding, where economic integration itself becomes a shield. Canada's move was not loud, it was methodical, and that may be the most important takeaway of all. Power is no longer just about who can impose costs. It's about who can endure them and who can convince others they don't have to. The United States remains central to the global system, but today that system reminded everyone, including Washington, that leadership is strongest when it is predictable. And predictability, at least this week, came from Capitol Hill rather than the White House. That subtle shift may echo longer than the tariff threat itself. Now we arrive at the most delicate question. What does President Donald Trump do next? Because if there's one thing Washington knows, it's this. Defeat is not a word that comfortably enters his vocabulary. The tariffs may be blocked, but the story is far from over. In fact, this may only be the intermission. Let's walk through the 3 most realistic paths forward. Scenario 1, administrative retaliation. If you can't use tariffs, you use friction. The executive branch still controls border enforcement, customs procedures, regulatory inspections, transportation security protocols. All of these can be tightened, legally, in ways that slow cross-border trade without technically violating the Senate's vote. More inspections, longer wait times, additional safety reviews. Nothing dramatic enough to make headlines on its own, but enough to create inconvenience, enough to remind Canada that executive power still has tools. This would be subtle escalation, bureaucratic pressure instead of headline-grabbing tariffs. And it would test how far institutional guardrails truly extend, because while Congress can block tariffs, it can't micromanage every truck at the border. Scenario 2, the legal war. Another possibility? Courtrooms. The White House could challenge the Senate's authority, arguing that national security powers reside firmly in the executive branch. An executive order invoking emergency authority could trigger a constitutional battle. That battle could land before the Supreme Court. And here's the catch. Markets dislike lawsuits almost as much as they dislike tariffs. Legal uncertainty freezes investment. It delays contracts. It complicates pricing decisions. Businesses don't thrive in gray zones. So while a legal fight might satisfy political instincts, it risks prolonging economic ambiguity, which was precisely what the Senate vote tried to avoid. Scenario 3, the strategic pivot. This is the least dramatic and perhaps the most strategic option. The president could pivot. He could declare that the mere threat of tariffs forced Canada into constructive dialogue. He could frame the Senate vote as evidence that his pressure worked. He could claim that strong leadership prevented unfair trade without needing to impose tariffs at all. Politically, this would be a reframing exercise. But reframing is not uncommon in Washington. It allows all sides to step back without admitting retreat. The question is whether the current rhetoric suggests de-escalation or doubling down. As of now, public messaging appears combative rather than conciliatory, and that raises the stakes. The wild card, political counterattack. There is one more layer. The president could turn inward, targeting the Republican senators who broke ranks. Primary threats, public criticism, campaign funding battles, that would shift the conflict from international trade to intra-party discipline. And if that happens, the story transforms from economic policy to political power consolidation. In other words, the fight moves from Ottawa to Capitol Hill. Why volatility isn't over, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is reportedly maintaining defensive readiness, economically and diplomatically. That suggests Ottawa believes the storm has not fully passed. And they may be right, because when institutional boundaries are tested this visibly, the aftershocks can ripple for weeks. Markets will monitor rhetoric. Businesses will monitor regulatory signals. Allies will monitor tone. Every statement now carries amplified weight. The bigger test. Ultimately, this moment isn't just about tariffs. It's about how the American system absorbs internal disagreement at high velocity. Can the executive branch recalibrate? Can Congress assert authority without triggering paralysis? Can allies negotiate without escalating tensions? Those are the real tests ahead. The Senate drew a line. Canada applied leverage. The White House now chooses the next move. And in geopolitics, the next move often defines the next decade. This wasn't the end of the conflict. It was the end of the first round. And if recent history has taught us anything, it's this. When Washington looks calm, it's often just reloading. The world is watching what happens next. History doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with a roll call vote and a number that changes the trajectory of power. 74 senators drew a line between economic stability and executive authority, and they chose stability. Prime Minister Mark Carney showed that disciplined strategy and economic leverage can sometimes outmaneuver political theatrics. President Donald Trump, for the first time in this chapter of his presidency, encountered resistance not from a foreign rival, but from within his own party. And that's what makes this moment bigger than tariffs. This is about institutional boundaries, about whether checks and balances still function under pressure, about whether political loyalty bends when economic consequences become too real to ignore. It's also about the future, because the real question isn't just who won this round, it's what this means for the next negotiation, the next crisis, the next test of power. Now we want to hear from you. Did Congress act responsibly to protect the economy, or did it weaken presidential leverage at a critical moment? Is Carney safeguarding Canada's sovereignty or escalating a rivalry that could deepen? Drop your perspective in the comments below. The smartest conversations happen when informed people disagree thoughtfully. And if you've stayed with us all the way to the end, thank you. Seriously. In a world of 15-second clips and recycled headlines, taking the time to understand the full picture matters. If this analysis helped you see beyond the noise, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Global Political Insight. Activate the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because when events move this fast, context is everything. Headlines will keep coming. Reactions will get louder. But here, we focus on understanding the shift beneath the surface. Stay informed, stay sharp, and we'll see you in the next report.